This is the story of how George Orwell wrote Animal Farm, the mountain he had to climb to get it published, and the enormous personal tragedy that ran beneath.
4 legs good, 2 legs bad.
Orwell always said that he got the idea for Animal Farm as long ago as 1937, and presumably it arose out of his Spanish experiences fighting against Franco. Although it's purportedly a fable written for a juvenile audience, Animal Farm was always going to be controversial. Essentially, it's a satire of the Soviet Revolution done in forensic detail at each major event in the progress of the Soviet Revolution as its answering call in Animal Farm. And Orwell knew, even as he began, that this was going to make trouble. And so there's a letter to his friend, the Russian academic Gleb Struve, from February 1944, where he says, "I'm writing a little squib which might amuse you when it comes out, but it is so not okay politically that I don't feel certain in advance that anyone will publish it. Perhaps that gives you a hint of its subject." That was written on the 17th of February. And so by the middle of the next month, when Orwell is writing to Gallancz, Victor Gallancz, who'd published his first 4 novels in England, and Gallancz, although by this point was probably not a paid-up Stalinist, in the 30s, he'd certainly taken some of his orders from King Street, the headquarters of the British Communist Party. And Orwell writes to him, "Dear Mr. Gallancz," quite matter of fact, I mean, Orwell always grabbed the bull by the horns on these occasions. "I think this comes under the heading of fiction. It's a little fairy story, but I must tell you that it is, I think, completely unacceptable politically from your point of view. It is anti-Stalin." So he was effectively telling Gallancz that he wasn't going to want to publish it, which is in effect is what happened. The firm of Nicholson and Watson turned it down simply on the grounds that why should we be offending one of our greatest political allies at such a crucial juncture in the Second World War? T.S. Eliot of Faber and Faber turned it down more or less on those grounds, but also adding what might to a modern era seem some rather sort of blunt remarks about the nature of the pigs. And so Eliot writes in, this is July 1944, so the process has been going on for 4 months by then. And he says, "After all, your pigs are far more intelligent than the other animals, and therefore the best qualified to run the farm. In fact, there couldn't have been an animal farm at all without them. So that what was needed, someone might argue, was not more communism, but more public-spirited pigs." So that was Eliot's reason for turning it down. More sinister even than this, probably, was the reason for which Jonathan Tate turned it down. Tate himself was very keen on publishing the book, but was then advised by an official of the Ministry of Information, a man called Peter Smollett, subsequently revealed as a communist spy, that the book would be very unhelpful in the current political situation. So it was a very, very close-run thing until finally Secker and Warburg, who'd published his Spanish book, Homage to Catalonia, agreed to publish it in the summer of 1944. It doesn't finally come out until August 1945, almost as the war is over, when, of course, it became an enormous success, Orwell's most successful book he'd so far published. Fan letters from the great and good. There's a wonderful story of the Queen, Queen Elizabeth, George VI's wife, who was very bookish in her way, sending out for a copy and discovering all the West End bookshops hadn't got it. And the emissary, I believe actually in the royal coach, had to go to Orwell's friend George Woodcock's anarchist bookshop and buy a copy there. So that's a wonderful sort of the meeting of two worlds in the publication of Animal Farm. It was taken up by book clubs in America, sold hundreds of thousands of copies there, but also did well here. Orwell's first popular success, the first book that he actually made very much money out of in the dozen years that he'd been publishing prior to that. The writing and the submission and the process of publication of Animal Farm happened at exactly the same time as a series of crises in Orwell's personal life. By this point, he'd been married to his first wife, Eileen, for over 7 years. They couldn't conceive a child. Orwell always fancied himself sterile, but Eileen had problems of her own. So by this point, they decided to adopt a process that would be facilitated by Eileen's sister-in-law, who was a GP and had access to these kind of procedures. And so in the early summer of 1944, just as all the publishing crises are going on, they adopt a small boy named Richard Horatio Blair. But this too was fraught with difficulty because at almost precisely at the same time, the little maisonette they were living in London, NW6, was bombed out. They were effectively homeless. But it got worse in the spring of 1945, infinitely worse, because Orwell went off at the instigation of David Astor and The Observer, went off to what was the now occupied Europe as a war correspondent, send dispatches back to the Sunday newspaper. Eileen went into hospital in Newcastle, near Newcastle, for a supposedly routine operation on fibroids in the womb. Heart gave out on the operating table, didn't come round, died. And so Orwell was left a widower with a small child that he was resolved and determined to raise himself, and with the prospect of a book still edging very, very slowly towards publication. So the two great crises of Orwell's life, the professional and the personal, are running together in the spring of 1945. And he remained traumatized by that for some time.
The answer to your first question, did he give me any inkling of my mother? I have no recollection that he ever did. This was a different world. He was looking forward rather than backwards, I think. Certainly his hurt was far deeper than he ever said to anybody.
Snowball set himself to solve the problem of power on the farm. And so did Napoleon.
Orwell always said that he got the idea for Animal Farm by watching quite a small boy leading quite a big cart horse along a country road, and suddenly wondering what would happen if the roles were reversed and the cart horse decided that it didn't want to be led along the road by the small child. He was a great fan of allegory involving animals. I mean, there are Swiftian resonances in Animal Farm. He also liked the fables of the French writer Fontaine. But one or two critics have pointed out that the 1930s was the great age of the cartoon animal, the anthropomorphized creature who wandered around in Disney and other kinds of cartoons. And significantly, I think Orwell thought at a very early stage that he would make a good cartoon. It's also, so I think it's a search in some ways, not only a search for a child, here he is adopting a child as he's writing a book guaranteed to appeal to children. But it's in some ways a search for his own childhood, because one of the interesting things about Animal Farm is trying to work out the basis of the historical reality of the farm and the people who inhabit it. I mean, it's a satire of the Russian Revolution from the mid-teens onward, but the actual world that Farmer Jones and his farm workers and the pigs and Boxer and the sheep inhabit is definitely pre-war. I mean, the farm is virtually unmechanized. There are very few references to motorized transport. Farmer Jones and his wife have a lithograph of Queen Victoria in their front room. As for Animal Farm itself, the Manor Farm, as it was originally called, there was a Manor Farm not very far from the stores at Wellington, where Orwell and Eileen lived in the late 1930s. There's also a Manor Farm close, not very far from his parents' home in Southwold. There's all kinds of ways in which that could have steeped into his consciousness. Orwell was also quite a smallholder when he lived in Wellington, and one of the goats that he raised was called Muriel, just like Muriel the goat in Animal Farm. And interestingly, he didn't like pigs. There's a letter to a friend from Jura where he says, we've been raising a pig here, and pigs are disgusting animals, and no one's really going to worry when this one goes to the butcher.
On farms owned and operated by pigs, there is order and discipline.
Orwell, as we know, was an extremely strange person emotionally and the way that he regarded the world. And even at the time that Animal Farm was becoming a success, we know that he was already making his preparations to leave London to go and live on the remote inner Hebridean island of Jura, where he could raise Richard and get on with 1984, his final book. After that, he lives on Jura, and there is this sense that he's kind of retreating from the world, that the idea of being a public man, a literary celebrity, was really not to his taste, and he wanted to spend the time that remained to him as far away from London as he could, just getting on with his work and raising his son.
I first read Animal Farm, I suppose, when I was at prep school, and I would have been 11, maybe 12. By this time, of course, Avril and Bill were beginning to sort of get me introduced to the fact that who my father really, really was. And so obviously reading Animal Farm was the beginning of reading Orwell. What did I think of it? I thought it was. I loved reading it. It has in 2 or 3 different levels. It says everything it has to say. You can't better it. You can't. To have stretched it out a bit further by putting in another 30% pages would probably ruin it. It was complete as it is.
To peace and plenty under pig rule.